Morena everyone. I know the construction sector normally starts quite early, but as you're all at home and many had to organise children or other household tasks, we delayed the start until 8:30. I also know that many of you are struggling with lockdown challenges at the moment, particularly those with young families. We really appreciate you taking time to spend with us this morning. I assume you all have your sites and tools secured, and if you haven't claimed the first wage subsidy yet, it's near the top of the list for this week or early next week. My name is James MacQueen, and I lead the construction specialisation for BDO in New Zealand. Nick Innes-Jones, a BDO Auckland Construction Sector Advisory Partner, and I will initially talk you through the findings of our 2021 construction survey. Stephen Toplis, who is Head of Research at BNZ, will then provide an economic update, which ties in really well with the findings of our survey and how we all need to respond to the current challenges. That should all take about 15 minutes, and then we'll then answer your questions. We'll take questions online. You're able to type in your questions after clicking on the little question mark logo at the top of your screen. Although the webinar is only an hour, we're happy to run over time on questions, so if you need to leave towards the end, that's fine. This is the fourth annual BDO Construction Survey in New Zealand. The results of this one are very different to the past. That led to our theme this year of rethinking construction. Data was collected during May and June 2021, and comparative data was collected from July 2020, following the first 2020 lockdown. We had a really good mix of responses, with 51% from the housing sector and the balance mostly from the commercial sector. It was split about 2/3 head contractors and over 20% subcontractors. Nick and I and the rest of the BDO construction specialists around the country have a real passion for the industry and its success, and we hope to provide you with as many ideas as we can on how you can rethink how you respond to the challenges and improve your business. We divided our survey and our report into what we see as the 4 priority areas in the sector. There are perhaps no surprises with these. Everyone is aware of the labour supply challenges, and these challenges are not restricted solely to construction. What our survey does is give some idea of the size of the problem, which then provides you with a framework as to how you will manage these challenges. Supply challenges are also well known. In some areas they seem to be getting worse, and I think the challenges are unlikely to disappear quickly. Inflation is the issue that worries me the most. Those of you that see emails from suppliers with price rises, and those that are forced to provide pay rises to staff to stop them leaving to work for competitors, clearly understand that inflation is real and growing. We have some interesting observations around the financial aspects, including some really positive news. A week into lockdown, I think we all need some really good news. And that is that at the time we collected the data, the industry was in its strongest position ever in terms of confirmed forward work. That's the highest we've seen in our 4 surveys. The other good news is, at least for the larger companies, gross margins seem to improve further too. So again, they're probably the best we've seen in the last 4 years. I'll have to say that different companies have different margins, so it doesn't necessarily apply to all. We're going to cover risk, but given we're all locked at home managing the COVID risk, we won't spend a lot of time on that today. I'll now pass to Nick, who will talk about the greatest concerns.
Right, thanks, James, and well done on your interview this morning on the breakfast show this morning with John Campbell. Before I start, my wife gave birth to my 2nd child last week, so if you hear a screaming baby in the background, I apologise. Also told my 2-year-old boy to stay out of the room, which he's protesting about, so I apologise in advance if he gets past my wife and barges in. I'm also a little bit sleep deprived, so please direct all your challenging questions to the well slept and much fresher James MacQueen. So each year we asked our respondents for their greatest challenges or concerns. This is my favourite question in the survey. one that we get the most media coverage from, and I'll read through and summarise all the hundreds of replies we get. I read every single comment. The comments in the next few slides are verbatim. I don't try to sugarcoat anything. Materials are the greatest challenge or concern for our respondents, being 60% of our respondents citing this. This is no surprise. Respondents had concerns with rising costs, availability, timely supply, pending price increases, especially for materials such as steel and timber. So we'll cover this in depth more shortly. Now, our number two concern was around staff, with 54% seeing this as a major issue in the industry. So the key comments we had regarding staff were with regards to retention of staff, rising labour costs, wages and salaries expectations of new staff being higher, the lack of skilled workers in the New Zealand economy, the ability to find appropriate contractors when required, rival companies poaching staff, literally coming onto sites and offering more. I've heard this several times from my clients, young or newly trained staff leaving for higher pay elsewhere, or simply just the quality of staff. The staffing was the greatest concern of our respondents in two of the previous three surveys that BDO has done. At number three, in terms of the greatest concerns, was government legislation. Most of us, even including us here at BDO, have been adversely impacted by the lack of response and lack of action relating to immigration and visas. We also haven't had too many positive comments about shovel-ready projects actually being ready. The inability to get infrastructure in place is having a massive impact on the companies working in the construction sector and the housing sector. And people were concerned about the new sick leave entitlement, which grants employees another 5-day sick leave, which many will take. So there were quite a fair few comments about government legislation. In fourth position were local councils. They've always featured as issue in our survey over the years. So delays for consenting and delays for building inspections seem to be getting worse. And in some areas, it's particularly noticeable in Auckland. Better resourcing, better systems, and a more sensible approach to risk management would make a huge difference. In terms of other concerns raised in our survey, we don't have slides for these today, but they are in our construction report. Forward work was the fifth biggest concern, and that was the inconsistency of forward work. 6 was financial factors, being gross margins, overall profitability, and cash flow challenges. I find this interesting as I'm fairly confident if I surveyed most other industries, financial factors wouldn't come in 6th place, it would be much higher. So this is a real positive for the industry, and it shows that the majority of companies were in a good, strong financial position when surveyed. Other concerns cited by our respondents were future lockdowns. So some people obviously saw this lockdown coming, an aging workforce, inflation, quality of design, documentation, succession planning, quality of workmanship, bonding capacity, transfer of risk, and land cost and availability. Many of these items we will discuss today.
Right, we'll now move to some detail. While non-availability of products and materials arising from disruption to production and shipping was expected, it seems to have progressively worsened and taken 12 months to become the major issue that it is today. Now, these issues are not unique to New Zealand. They apply around the world and seem to be getting worse. Therefore, we can't rely on the rest of the world to solve these challenges for us. It's going to take some time to significantly improve. Fortunately, most products do arrive, just late or some substitution is possible. The products and materials our respondents told us were causing the most problems at the time of our survey included steel, timber, plywood, imported materials, and appliances. Some people provided a very long list, and some simply said everything. Particular items seem to change a little each month, Now this has consequences. The main consequence is delays. And the delays lead to reduced margins. And that's due to staff and equipment being on site for longer than planned. No, it's more P&G costs, and also the risk of liquidated damages where the contract provides for those. There's also delayed occupation, and therefore that prolongs interest costs until the building can be occupied, and that can change developers' margins and the confidence of their funders. The industry has it's really already applied a rethink strategy and dramatically changed its procurement processes. On the way to work each morning, I drove past a very large area of stockpile timber. That was not there 3 months ago. It was grass. One client on a very large multi-level residential project is still putting in the foundations at the moment, but they've already ordered the letterboxes. Now that would not have occurred a few months ago. The question is whether these changes in procurement are sufficient or is more adaptation required. Do we need the client to bear the brunt of the risk? I think we're very close to that. But builders, constructors, subcontractors can't take the supply chain risks on their own, particularly if they continue to get worse. Move on to inflation. Now, the prospect of inflation is now the greatest concern of respondents, and in my view is likely the greatest emerging risk to the strength and the survival of industry participants. Our survey asked about the expectation of rising costs needing to flow onto clients. Only 3% did not think higher costs would need to be passed on to clients. Another measure is that a whopping 70% of respondents saw increased cost of materials eroding margins as the greatest adverse impact of COVID on their business. Emails from suppliers advising builders and construction companies of price increases are being received weekly. Increases are more than the gross margin of many companies. This issue is not restricted to materials. The acute shortage of labour in the sector is significantly forcing up labour costs too. We've been through a prolonged period of low inflation, and most building contracts have a fixed price. Initially, builders and subcontractors were being forced to absorb the price increases. That is simply not sustainable, and practices need to change quickly. Significant inflation is new territory for the majority of the industry. This is where a rethink is required. The challenge the industry faces is estimating these increases to still be able to provide clarity to the client on price, or alternatively changing the contract terms. So the most common way is a contract called P&G plus margin, or preliminary and general costs plus margin. That means the client takes the risk of price increases on the materials and subcontractors. Or the other way is indexing and tagging key materials, where the client takes the risk just for those indexed or tagged materials and certain labour costs. These increases are already impacting margins, with expectations around future margins being quite pessimistic and variable. We'll now go back to Nick, who'll talk about staff shortages.
So skilled staff shortages was the greatest challenge identified in our survey in 2018 and 19. This eased post-lockdown in 2020 and has now rebounded to be the second greatest challenge in 2021. This is a huge and long-standing issue, amplified by the cyclical nature of the sector and the current very high demand for both housing and commercial buildings. So let me explain the graph that's on your screen. Just over 30% of our respondents are okay with their staffing needs, and that's the lowest level we've seen in the last 3 years. Over 50% are looking for additional on-site staff. That's the greatest over the period we have surveyed. So I'll say it again, over 50% of those surveyed were looking for additional on-site staff. So the need for and shortage of office-based staff has roughly doubled compared to the prior years. And there is less than a handful of companies that are overstaffed. Very, very few of our respondents said that they were overstaffed. So winning the war on talent is a major focus. of management and will only get tougher when we eventually reopen the bubble with Australia again. So once talent's been attracted, individual companies and the sector as a whole need to keep its people highly motivated so they want to stay working in it. This requires organisations to create a culture that recognises the needs of a younger workforce and stands them apart from their competitors. So the impact of immigration restrictions on labour. We all know the industry is desperately short of labour capacity. James talked about this on the breakfast show this morning with John Campbell. So while we must recruit and train staff in New Zealand, we're heavily reliant on immigration to fill our needs and provide a buffer to assist and manage the cyclical nature of the industry. So the closed border to new staff is a major factor in the current shortages, and recent political announcements to the current lockdown are not going to change the position for most of you. Survey responses show that it's mainly felt in larger companies that contribute the majority of new building and houses by value. The industry also needs to improve productivity or reduce the reliance on some immigrant labour. However, that's a catch-22, as companies with specialist equipment that can transform productivity are also having major challenges to get specialist staff into New Zealand to train operators, install and service equipment. So reliance on work visas. So the larger turnover companies need to employ the greater number of staff and therefore have the more reliance on immigrants with temporary work visas. The risk to these companies and the construction sector as a whole is the non-renewal of these work visas. This is not solely a construction sector issue. We, as accountants and business advisors at BDO, we face this issue, as do most of our non-construction clients. So this graph depicts the scale of the risk for those with a turnover greater than 10 million. What the key message here is that half of the industry participants would be significantly disrupted if existing work visas are not renewed or replacement immigrants are not permitted to enter into New Zealand. Secured, so this slide covers our respondents' forward work position. So secured forward work is a critical measure of the future strength or weakness of the sector. A question to define work in the context of being able to operate at above break even for the relevant period. Auckland was in a strong position with 36% having over 12 months profitable forward work and a further 23% having 6 to 12 months of profitable forward work. Wellington also had a high number of respondents with forward work over 12 months. Companies in the South Island and the rest of New Zealand had a fairly even spread across the categories. Unsurprisingly, those 60% of the larger companies have over 12 months forward work, and the results for the commercial were similar to housing. We all know that housing is currently having its greatest boom ever. I encourage that everyone focuses on quality projects at good margins rather than simply chasing turnover. And this is another area where a rethink of company strategy would be worthwhile. What this slide covers is gross margins of head contractors with turnovers greater than 10 million. A survey found that head contractors with turnovers greater than 10 million have generally achieved an improvement in gross margins over the past 12 months, with only 24% of respondents saying that their gross margin has slightly or significantly decreased. Margins in our 2020 survey and also our benchmarking data were up compared to 2018 and 2019. But before we start celebrating too much, the industry needs these better margins for its survival and now to cope with the current wage and material inflation challenges, which are significant, and the cost of lockdowns, and who knows how long this current lockdown is going to go for. Companies with turnover below 10 million did not fare as well, with half experiencing either slight or significant reductions in gross margins. We've been debating why this is, and we think it's we have a sense that it's a combination of fixed price contracts and the impacts of inflation whereas many larger companies negotiate a BNG plus margin type contract. And also secondly, after the first lockdown last year, a lot of proposed projects were cancelled and there was a race to the bottom behaviour, which saw lowball bidding just to win projects and have something to do. Those projects are now being completed now, and we're seeing the consequences of that behaviour. So gross margins for subcontractors. Subcontractors indicated that their gross margins had decreased over the past 12 months, with 62% experienced declining gross margins over the past 12 months. This is likely due to wage costs and material costs and increasing the subcontractor market, which haven't been able to be passed on to the head contractors. Delays in projects also may impact the decrease in gross margins. Only 20% of our subcontractors experienced an improvement in gross margins. And finally, cash resources. I'll run through the slide pretty quickly. Nearly 90% of our respondents said they could pay their creditors on time. Cash prior to this lockdown did not seem to be a problem, so let's hope it stays this way. So now I'll pass you back to James, who will talk to you about succession planning.
Thanks very much, Nick. Now, succession planning, this is our area of passion. But first, not only is the industry short of skilled staff, but we found that over the next 10 years, it's going to lose the experienced leadership across nearly 70% of the organisations in it. That loss of experience in an industry with high risks, low margins, and dramatic cycles, and screaming out for more experienced people, is likely to put additional pressure on some parts of the sector. BDO are actively assisting a significant number of organisations with their succession planning. Companies in the sector are seldom sold to a stranger or on the open market, particularly head contractors. Research shows that a well-managed succession plan provides the best outcome for the retiring owner, the business, the new owners. The journey normally takes about 5 years, including preparation for sale, negotiating the deal, and making progress with payments. If there's no heir apparent or the likely purchaser needs to be found or groomed, up to 10 years is more common. It therefore pays to start the journey early. The other reason to start early is to manage the consequences of the tough periods in the economic cycle, when profitability and value are depressed, because the values of construction companies goes up and down with the economic cycles. Company culture, systems and training all play a part in attracting, retaining and developing the best people for future leadership and ownership. Selecting the right people as successors and having the right plan is critical. You normally only get one shot at getting it right. There are lots of stories, good and bad, that we can tell. There's not enough time today. In relation to our survey, 28% have an owner who will exit within 10 years and they have no plan. For them, an urgent rethink and some good advice is required. Retentions. Talked about retentions for a long time. The retentions regime was introduced in 2015, was very poorly drafted, and our annual surveys have consistently shown about 25% of those that should be holding retention money do not do so in full accordance with the intent of the legislation or in a separately identified trust account. This is about to change. The government has introduced a bill that significantly strengthens the legislation. That includes a requirement to hold the funds in a separately designated trust account, and there's a penalties regime for non-compliance. There will also be enhanced reporting and some clarity and provisions in the event of an insolvency appointment. For the 23% in our survey that should be but are not using a separate trust account, they will shortly need to change their procedures. The question is, can they? And for the 64% who have retentions owing but have never inspected to ensure their retentions are held correctly, they should be inspecting and will have enhanced inspection rights. Draft bill still has some major flaws. We identified some of these and have assisted with submissions. I expect the lockdown is going to delay the update to the law further. Project delays spiked after the first lockdown, but have gone back to historic levels after the supply chain issues are cited as the biggest single contributor. It seems the unwieldy bureaucracy and frustration with council processes and timeframes is top of the list, with half those surveyed noting at least 25% of projects were delayed for those reasons. There are some rethinks required here too. As we heard from Nick earlier, councils were number 4 concern. Creating the solution for that needs to start at the top of the industry and with the Minister for Construction. I made some suggestions before around pushing costs of supply chain back to clients, and obviously COVID lockdown clauses in contracts are more common. So that sort of, question is, do we need a similar clause in relation to material delays? Tender or negotiation success is a new question in 2021. I find the graph quite interesting. This one is for head contractors. There's a reasonable spread between winning 1 in 5 projects, those are in that 50% mark, through to winning most projects. I would hope to see some weighting towards the bottom, as when we're in boom times, as we are at the moment, the clients are likely to be more motivated to negotiate with a small number rather than seek lots of tender prices when people are busy and just interested in putting in an effort that's unlikely to result in winning work. The graph for subcontractors is in our report and is weighted to the 40 to 60% area, with only 1% of subcontractors winning most of what they price. Most risks in construction are project related, but financial and other risks should not be overlooked. Our survey collected a lot of data about risk, and it's set out in the report. It's time to rethink and review the risks that you're exposed to and how they can be mitigated or reallocated, not to the party below you, but to the best party able to manage them or absorb them. BDO in the UK performed a survey and released their report earlier this year. It's on their website if you're interested. There's no surprises. It's very similar to New Zealand, especially supply chain and labour. The item missing is inflation, but their information was collected about January this year, before inflation really took off. But their cash flows have changed post-Brexit, and 31% of them are finding it difficult to obtain funding. BDO Canada also produced a similar report earlier this year. The sector over there does not seem to be in good shape, and it's the same issues. In USA, their timber, well, they call it lumber over there, their lumber inflation rose by about 260%. It has since dropped about 40% from that peak. Stephen shortly may have a view on whether our inflation is going to be prolonged or short-lived. The key message is the rest of the world has much the same issues, so we can't rely on them to solve our challenges. It's up to us. See the comment at the bottom of the slide. The English knew what was coming for us back at the start of this year. Their gravest challenge or worry was future COVID-related restrictions. It's not a surprise as we're now in a lockdown again, so the opportunity is on how we all take the time to rethink how we do business in this new economic and health environment, and with all the challenges we've talked about today. And much of these risks, how much will you take and how much must the industry push back these risks onto new clients? The clients are unlikely to ask for it, so it's the head contractors and the subcontractors listening to us today. It needs to be led by you. I'd like to thank those that participate in our research. We can only do it with your cooperation. And for those that have not participated before and would like to do so, please provide your details. Now, after this webinar, you can download our report and share it with your team and your clients and suppliers and some subcontractors. For those that registered for this webinar, you should be able to get an email with a link. What we need is the whole industry to respond appropriately to the current challenges for the benefit and the survival of us all. We're now going to transfer across to Stephen Toplis, who is Head of Research at BNZ. He's well known for his insightful analysis and commentary, so I won't spend more time introducing him. I've seen his slides and he's about to provide a fascinating and really informative perspective of the economy and where it's headed.
Yeah, thanks. First of all, could I just say it's very interesting that when I was asked to produce this little outlook for New Zealand, I went off and did my own thing without any consultation whatsoever with the chaps at BDO. And they went off and did their own thing with the survey. And it so turns out that we've come out with exactly the same conclusions from very different angles. But I think what it does highlight is that the issues that are confronting us are not just pertaining to your sector, but pertaining to the entire economy. And the issues going forward are going to get greater rather than lesser. I should add, pass a compliment to the quality of the survey. In my job, I get to see bucket loads of surveys from various people. I'd go so far as to say 95% of them are a complete waste of time. This one isn't. It's in depth and really gets to the crux of the issues. So congratulations to those that put the survey together and to the respondents for being so frank in there. So, what I want to do is really go through a subcomponent of a very big story. To be quite honest, in the current environment, I could talk for hours and still not cover off all the issues that we're going to confront. But if I leave you with nothing else, the slide in front of you at the moment is basically what you need to know. Obviously, some of the pictures that I've drawn were drawn pre-lockdown, so we're having to do a bit of a rethink on some things, but the broad picture will remain unchanged. I mean, first and foremost is the economy's absolutely on fire. And, you know, if I'd been talking to you 12 months ago when we're in the midst of our, or 18 months ago now, in the midst of our first lockdown, and suggested to you that the economy would be operating above capacity, that commodity prices would be at record highs, that house prices would have gone up 30%, that the unemployment rate would have dropped below 4%, that you wouldn't be able to find staff, and that inflation was rising aggressively, you would probably have told me that I was mad. But in fact, that's exactly what's happened. So we're in a position of extreme shortage of supply of labour. Input costs are surging everywhere. There are bottlenecks everywhere. Inflation's rising. But the corollary to this, of course, is that interest rates are going to go up. And the Reserve Bank at the moment is facing a very, very difficult battle to contain the price pressures that are in the economy. All of this, of course, has been now exacerbated by the fact that COVID has returned to our shores. It was always going to happen. It shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. I think the surprise, if anything, is that we've got the Delta variant rather than the fact that we've just got COVID. So just want to sort of go through those things one by one. So why have we got a strong economy? Well, I mean, fundamentally, the single biggest reason that we've got a strong economy is because we've kept COVID out. And I know it's repeated over and over again by the politicians, and we all get a bit tired of it. But the economic success of the country is directly tied to the health success of the economy. We are one of a very few economies on the planet whose activity levels are already above the activity levels that we were facing pre-COVID. And I think it pays to take just a second to cast your mind back to the extent that you can. It seems like a lifetime ago, to look at what New Zealand looked like prior to COVID's arrival. And remember, if you go back to prior to COVID's arrival, and this shows up actually in some of the surveys, we were actually already facing a tight economy. We were struggling to get enough labour. There were concerns that net migration would soften up. There were concerns that general inflation was rising, and there were concerns that the central bank would need to raise interest rates. So in many ways, we shouldn't really be surprised where we are, because we've gone back to pre-COVID levels, except the demand is greater than pre-COVID levels, but the supply environment is much, much worse. But alongside that massive fiscal stimulus that we've got and monetary stimulus that's kept us going, we've seen an immensely strong commodities environment, commodities globally at record highs, delivering this economy a massive windfall gain, which has flowed right through the economy. We've got massive domestic infrastructure spending driven by both central and local government, and that was going to happen anyway. I know a lot of it's been put on the plan because of COVID, but actually there was a massive infrastructure spend put out by government immediately before COVID hit. We've got a booming construction sector in general, largely as we try to fulfil New Zealand's housing needs, but also flowing through into non-residential construction. We've got government sector growth generally. Labor governments typically employ more government people. This one's no exception, but this one's a traditional Labor government on steroids, because in addition to its normal increase in staff, it's got all the staffing increases associated with keeping COVID out. And just to cap things off, we've had asset prices which have risen quite aggressively. So when you see that long list of things, it really is no surprise that the economy is doing what it's doing. But the headwinds are now strengthening, and as already discussed by James and Nick, it's not demand that's the issue. It's simply supply, and the supply is being impacted through your labour market, but also supply chains for materials more generally. So, as I've suggested already, inflationary pressures are rising, which means interest rates will rise, which also means, and people are forgetting this, that if those two things happen, then you'll actually get an asset price correction of some description as well. And this is a really weird environment for a lot of people to operate in, and yet you really do have to rethink your entire operational framework. When I spend an awful lot of time wandering around the country talking to businesses of all descriptions, and there are so many people out there now, even in relatively high levels of management, who have never operated in a world of rising interest rates. They have absolutely zero idea what that means. They've also never had to operate in a world of rising prices. So, this will require a complete rethink from a big cohort of people who believe that inflation and interest rates never go up and asset prices only go up. So what I want to do is just show you some pictures of the things that we've been talking about to put it in perspective. So before you, you've got the unemployment rate, and what you see from that is that the real fear that most commentators had that the unemployment rate would skyrocket post-COVID, as COVID arrived, never really materialised. But bear in mind that the average forecast for expected unemployment was 10%. So that's off the top of the graph that you're looking at, completely off the top of the graph you're looking at. As it turned out, the unemployment rate in New Zealand peaked at a smidgen over 5%. Now it's at 4% and falling quite aggressively. Now this is important, and this little picture will explain how the Reserve Bank looks at the unemployment rate, but also will explain your job shortages. Is the shaded area there is the range at which the Reserve Bank believes that the economy is operating at full employment. The middle of that range, which is the most likely outcome, says that full employment comes when the unemployment rate is 4.5%. So the economy is already 0.5% below full employment. That's the excess demand for labour. And what's more, it's going to go lower still, and it's conceivable that we will see a record low in the unemployment rate in the modern era. Notwithstanding that in the next quarter or two, you're again going to see one of those little COVID-driven spikes, but it's not going to be anywhere near as large as COVID Mark 1. So the picture before you now is a survey conducted by the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research. And this is a survey of all businesses and of all types. And what they say to the businesses is they've just got a general question, which is, what is the single biggest factor constraining your production? So 1 in 4 businesses now report that the single biggest constraint to higher production is labour. Now, that's not taking into consideration who might think it's the second most important constraint. That is an absolute record high and looks like it's going higher. So not only are you competing for labour amongst each other, but you are also competing for labour against other industries. And you'd be absolutely staggered when you see a breakdown of the survey as to what sectors labour is a constraint to production. I mean, who'd have thought that the hospitality industry and the tourism industry would be reporting their inability to find staff as one of the factors preventing them from increasing output at the moment? But that indeed is the case. Another question that comes from that same survey is businesses are asked, is it becoming more or less difficult to find labour? And you'll see that a vast majority of businesses are reporting increasing difficulty in finding both skilled and unskilled labour. Now, until recently, that trajectory was dominated by lack of skilled staff. But now it's a complete inability to find unskilled staff as well. And where this becomes really problematic, and I'm sure most of you have experienced this, is, to put it bluntly, you are really now scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of the new staff that you employ. They're people who you would not have employed previously. They don't have the right skill set, they don't have the right motivation for work, they may be too young, too old, whatever to do the job. But you're having to employ them, and not only are you having to employ them, but you're having to pay them twice as much as you'd like. And as a consequence of that, not only is your costs going up in a direct sense, but your costs are going up in an indirect sense because your effective productivity is dropping from each person that you employ. And this, again, is going to be an ongoing concern. And I think it's worth taking into consideration that COVID is as much a supply shock as it is a demand shock. And so to the extent that COVID is again hit, your supply of labour is coming under more downward pressure. So when you get a tight labour market, what you do is get very much higher turnover in the labour market. That means that people feel comfortable that they can move from one source of employment to another, which also means that they feel comfortable asking for more money, and that's exactly what's happening. Why is all this happening? Well, the root cause of a lot of it is net immigration. And as you can see there, the yellow line on the chart shows you what's happened to net immigration. The blue line is your working age population, which is effectively your available labour force. And you can see that has slumped. We've got very short memories. It's it's bemusing to think that about 18 months ago, the biggest point of discussion was the fact that we were letting too many people into the country, putting pressure on housing markets and clogging up the roads, and we had to do something about it. And now, of course, we've gone to the diametrically opposite end of the scale. This, I think, is probably our single biggest risk in terms of labour markets going forward. Every man and his dog has a forecast that looks like ours, and that is the assumption is that once the borders open, net migration actually comes inward, and that alleviates a lot of our problems. I'm not entirely convinced of that, because the labour shortages that we are recording are extreme, but actually Australia is recording labour shortages, UK is reporting labour shortages, US is reporting labour shortages, Europe is starting to report the first signs of labour shortages, Canada is reporting labour shortages. The competition for labour is going to be really, really high. And as borders open, there's actually an equal chance that people leave the country to find work offshore as those who want to come in. So don't think that border opening will necessarily fix your issues. Just quickly, and you'll all be aware of this, but obviously the cost of labour are rising everywhere. You've got minimum wage increases, you've got living wage increases, you've got the Mondayisation of Anzac and Waitangi Day, you've got an extra paid holiday, Matariki, you've got COVID-related costs, you've got labour supply mismatches, and it seems to me that the vast majority of the New Zealand population cannot differentiate between the words annual and sick. So having doubled the sick leave means that you're going to have to pay a lot more there as well. So total cost of labour are extreme. In addition to that, and we've already highlighted, Nick and James have already highlighted the costs of materials, which are rising aggressively, but you've got freight costs and delays, which are huge. To give you some idea, the average cost of a container from China used to be around $3,000 to $4,000. Some people are now paying in excess of $20,000 and up to $30,000 for those same containers. That's going to put huge imposts on imported materials. One thing to keep an eye on, which might be positive, is the price of log exports from New Zealand has just dropped almost 30% in the last few weeks. If that is the start of an ongoing trend, then at least that may offer you some relief, but it's going to be small relative to the bigger picture. In addition to that, we've got infrastructure bottlenecks everywhere. By that, roading, transport, electricity costs are rising. Environmental costs are rising, and everybody will be impacted. That commodity prices general are rising, and as you would well know, your compliance costs are going up. So again, this margin squeeze is everywhere. So what does it all mean for the central bank and interest rates, and in turn your debt? Well, the Reserve Bank's targets are under threat. Basically, unemployment's falling, inflation's rising, and housing's a problem. It couldn't get worse. So don't get too sort of bemused by the picture in front of you, the output gap. All you have to know from that picture is if the blue line is above 0, it means that the economy is running above capacity, and the central bank has to look towards having monetary conditions tighter than neutral. And if it's below that black line, it means that conditions are soft and the central bank needs to lower interest rates. As you can see, the output gap is well and truly above the line, and this is the root cause of why the central bank is looking to raise interest rates. And I think it's important to recognise just how far above that 0 line it is. So even in the event that this COVID outbreak puts a dent in economic activity, it's going to have to put a big dent in economic activity to take away the inflationary pressure that's currently there. Reserve Bank, unfortunately, targets consumer price inflation only. That is problematic, of course, because most of the inflation in the economy has been outside of the consumer price index. It's been everywhere else. But now the consumer price index is catching up as well. And again, if inflation is below the Reserve Bank's target midpoint, then it needs tighter monetary conditions. It is headed, annual inflation is headed for 4%, which is the highest it's been since 2012, and again, consistent with higher interest rates. And then there's unemployment, and the Reserve Bank is being very, very conservative in its forecast of unemployment, which look like will be well and truly beaten. Again, I highlight that black line across the middle. That's full employment. So if an unemployment rate's below that, they've achieved their maximum sustainable employment objectives and need tighter monetary conditions. And last but not least, we got just stupid house prices in New Zealand. Yes, every country in the world's seen rising house prices, but look what we've achieved relative to the rest of the planet, and it's just purely nonsensical. It is not sustainable, and the Reserve Bank and government will do everything they can to stop that happening. So, all in all, higher interest rates. So the picture before you, the grey line there is what we're forecasting will happen to interest rates. The yellow line is what the Reserve Bank is forecasting will happen to interest rates. The blue line is what market is currently pricing. So for what it's worth, we think central bank starts raising interest rates in October by 25 basis points and keeps going until the cash rate is well and truly above 2%. And we do also believe that you'll get a moderate house price correction in line with higher interest rates, and what is increasingly looking like might become an excess supply in housing. At the moment, and this is largely ignored by just about everybody, at the moment we are building far more houses than we need to cope with population growth. We are reducing any excess demand in the housing stock by around 20 to 30,000 houses per annum. So at that pace of building, it will not take very long before any perceived housing undersupply becomes an oversupply. In terms of activity in your sector, we do think that you're going to get a correction in activity in residential, but not for a while yet. Also, if you're looking at levels of activity, the total level of activity over this period stays at least as high as where it is now. All I'm saying is when you're doing your business forecasts, don't assume you're going to get the same levels of growth in the next few years. If for no other reason, as you'd well know, is you simply can't get the same levels of growth because there's not the supply there to deal with it. And last but not least, just to finish off with a couple of COVID-related graphs. If you look at that picture, GDP is all over the place. What we saw with COVID Mark 1, very, very sharp downturn followed by very, very steep upturn. We think you're going to get exactly the same from this particular outbreak, except that the extremes won't be as large. And if you want to put that in context, I think it's very important to realise this, is the big downturn that we had got completely reversed and put us back on trend growth. We see no reason why this one won't do exactly the same. But word of caution, I think far too many people are too optimistic at how quickly we're going to get rid of Delta this time round. Just a reminder that in our first lockdown, we had 33 days in level 4, 16 days in level 3, and 25 days in level 2. So far, we've had 7 days in level 4. So there could well be a while to go yet. So just to wrap everything up, I'm really positive about New Zealand in the long term. We're incredibly well placed, but we do have some major short-term headwinds. We're entering an environment that is completely foreign to a lot of people, and managing your way through this and thinking differently is going to be the secret to success. And I'll leave it there.
Right. Thank you very, very much, Stephen. Just wait for you to pass to me. Thank you very, very much, Stephen. That was very, very insightful. I agree with quite a few of your frank comments, and I'm hearing the same sort of comments from my clients as well. And your insights in terms of activity levels, inflation, interest rates, and so on. Yeah, that's going to be very, very useful for the industry going forward. Now, we've received quite a few questions. What I'm proposing, I'll answer a couple of questions, then we'll go to Nick to answer a couple of questions, and by then Stephen will have had a chance to think about the questions that have been put to him. One of the questions put to me was, we need to rethink construction, therefore rethink our construction methods. And are there other construction methods like offsite fabrication, 3D building, things like that that we should be thinking about? I'll answer that in several different parts. Modular or offsite certainly can be a lot more efficient and a lot cheaper. However, pretty much not everybody, but most people who've given it a go have failed and gone into liquidation. And the reason for that is that only works if you've got a really good steady supply of projects. So you can keep operating at full capacity because you've got a massive factory cost and so on that you've got to keep paying for. I think, so therefore, if we've got a smaller number of people doing that and a full workload, then it works well. Otherwise, it's challenging. I've got some clients that are very, very efficient in terms of the utilisation of labour, and it's a matter of, when they're doing a number of different projects that are all reasonably similar, using the same team and learning and just continuing to enhance their processes, they are getting a much better labour efficiency than what they got in their earlier projects. So it is achievable. One interesting cost question, we've got to pass the cost on to clients. What if the clients refuse to pay and then the government's demanding more housing? What's the government's role in this? Well, Stephen sort of partly answered that, because I think supply and demand will even out as interest rates go out. But the reality is we still need more houses at this stage. If the government wants more houses, my simple response is the government needs to pay more for them rather than beat up the construction industry and expect the construction industry to perform an impossible task. So I think building costs will continue to go up. If overall house prices have come down, then the only lever we have left is land prices. And so perhaps as interest rates go up, that will put pressure on, and land prices might ease off a little bit to enable the market to equalise again. I'll now pass back across to Nick to answer a couple of questions.
Okay, thanks, James. I've got two questions here to answer. The first one was, someone was wondering whether staffing pressures differ depending on location. Simple answer to that is no, not really. It was slightly worse in Auckland, but it was pretty much bad throughout the whole country. It seemed to be a bigger issue in larger companies, especially those that rely on immigrant labour. The other question I have is, with margins being driven down, why are we still having retentions held? And it's an interesting question. Many respondents to the survey in the comment section will get, I'll read their answers verbatim. They said they're actually trying to refuse retentions wherever they can within their contract. So, however, I think retentions still obviously have a place to ensure that jobs are done correctly. And obviously they're important that retentions are collected because they form such a large portion of someone's profit on a job. So I'll now go to Stephen and let him answer his couple of questions.
Yeah, I don't actually have access to the questions.
Well, Stephen, I'll read one of them out to you. It was, do you think there's a risk we go to negative net migration as Australia is paying more, lower house prices, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a very big risk. We've got no way of modelling it, but we do know that you probably get paid 30 to 50% more depending on which job you're in Australia. The cost of your house might be cheaper, and in addition to that, the cost of living generally is cheaper unless you're in central Sydney and central Melbourne. So I think there is a very real risk that we do lose labour to Australia if it gets its act together over there and the economy strengthens post the current outbreak.
Thanks, Stephen. And the other question I've got here is similar question, how much more effective and performing would our economy be if our access to labour was greater, i.e. with immigration, both skilled and unskilled, was increased, construction workers, hospitality and tourism, route pickers, so on?
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that having access to that migrant labour would be extremely useful across the board. You can't deny that. But what I would say is I'm not sure that changing the rules substantively will make a huge difference. In particular, one of the things that people forget is as the world becomes increasingly COVID-free and it becomes safe to leave New Zealand, then there's a whole pile of people here already who haven't been home for 18 months. And there's a whole another pile of people who are dying to do their big OE, the sort of the cohort of 20 to 30-year-olds, if you like. And so I think while it'd be great to get a lot more migrants, that's not necessarily going to happen with any change in policy.
So Stephen, James, you're on mute. Sorry, I was going to go to Stephen, but James, you go. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Technical challenges. There was a question which I'll read out the question, try and answer it, and Stephen might have a view as well. It says the BDO team, along with many others, suggest risk needs to lie with the best owner and suggest P&G plus margin contracts. And the comment is that banks won't fund on this basis. What is the solution? I tend to act for the construction sector, and my simple view is that the client needs to select a construction company that they have confidence they can perform well and finish the project. So therefore client selection is the first step. And then, if P&G plus margin is the best way and you're using a well-respected construction company, that is the best way to build the building and share the cost. And the bankers just need to understand that and understand that, that the cost is not finite. So that Stephen might have a view.
Yeah, I mean, I must concede I'm not involved in lending decisions in any way, shape or form, so I can't really comment on the specific bank actions. But I do believe that in this environment, you have to somehow share risk. And throughout every economic cycle, we tend to have 100% of the risk on one side or the other. You can't do this in this environment, but it has to be shared risk when you're in this situation. Of course, I think we're and I'm talking generically here for the banking sector. A lot of the people who are most vulnerable to movements and cost are the small guys, and the small guys are building for the small customer. So in an environment of heightened risk, that means you're basically doubling the risk on both sides of the equation. And I think that's when lending decisions become actually quite difficult.
Thank you for that. One of the questions was, what was the sample size of the survey? We ended up having about 150 people respond to the survey, and therefore Now, for a lot of the statistics, we thought we could get some reasonably good analysis out of it. Where we could, we tried to divide by region or organisation size. Where we could do that successfully, that's in our report. But where we felt that the sample size was a bit too small, we've sort of refrained from trying to use statistics that might be misleading. On that point, one of the questions was, you showed some stats re increased margins for greater than 10 million turnover companies. Could we comment on what the margin range is? Yeah. The answer is that one's all over the place. In our previous surveys, we were able to analyse margins and produce some reasonably good graphs. So that's in our previous surveys. This year, as I say, it was all over the place and we struggled a bit to make some real sense out of it. Hence, we sort of looked at the overall trend in margins, which is what we've talked about today and is in our report. But look, for those that, margins in head contractors go from about 3% through to some of the good people are getting, 15% or something like that. But those that are really high margins are quite specialist projects that are not undertaken by the majority of construction companies. So the midpoint for head contractors around about that 8% mark. Now for subcontractors, a wide range, but a lot of subcontractors are performing projects on well under 20% margin, some on 10% margin. Subcontractors carry a much higher level of overheads in proportion to turnover, and therefore those that are sort of on 10% margins are treading water or losing money, and subbies, they need at least 20%, but it depends by industry a little bit, and it depends what overheads they've got. Now there was a question, Stephen, do you see bank lending rates will rise to, where do you think bank lending rates will rise to, and is it best to fix long or to float? Yeah, look, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that there are a multitude of things that go into the decisions by banks as to how to set their lending rates. There's the cash rate, the underlying rates in the funding markets, there's liquidity, there's risk, there's capital controls imposed by the Reserve Bank. So just being able to forecast where the cash rate goes does not in and of itself tell you where the lending rates will go. That said, what I can say is that we are forecasting the cash rate to rise by over 2%. So it would be reasonable to assume that if none of the other factors changed, then your floating rates would go up by a similar margin. Longer term rates would typically not go up by the same margin because long-term rates are already pricing in an expectation that interest rates are going to go up. So you would end up in effect a flattening of the yield curve with your floating rate rising faster than your longer term. The decision whether to fix or float is always a very personal decision depending on your own risk characteristics. It's also highly dependent on what you think you might want to repay. So for example, if you think that there's a reasonable chance that you might have a windfall gain and you want to pay things off in a lump sum, well, to avoid paying penalty costs, then you would actually take more of a risk on the floating component. If, however, you're sitting there going, hell, if interest rates rose 3%, I'm going to be broke, and I don't want to take on that risk. Well, then you just go longer down the curve. But that's a discussion that any individual should have with their lender to clarify what's the best outcome for themselves. Thank you for that. I've just lost my stuff. Thank you, guys. I think we've probably reached about time, and so I'd really like to thank Stephen for his presentation and assistance. really insightful. And thank you, Nick, for your participation and presentation and assistance putting the whole thing together. It's been quite a journey. Now, we're expecting to, for those that have registered for this, you should receive an email with a link which will take you to the BDO website so that you can download and read our survey. Or if you don't, or if you want to get it straight away, if you just go to the BDO website, put in the keyword construction, I'm sure that will take you straight to the survey and you can download it and read it. We've only summarised today some of the key things that are in the survey. You'll find it very, very insightful reading. So thank you very, very much for your participation.